So now we come to the Reformation. Uh, Remember that the Reformation is this great religious change that occurs in the 1500s throughout Western Europe. Now, before we look at the Reformation, we need to see how the Reformation and the Renaissance go hand in hand. Because without the Renaissance, the Reformation really wouldn't have the legs that it ultimately does. One of the most important things is that there are a lot of social changes in the Renaissance that we talked about in the last lecture. We've talked about how landholding nobles faced declining incomes, how the church continued to want to receive money from monarchs and from the nobility, and there was this lack of extra fund for the people up at the top. And then at the same time, you have more peasants that were legally free. People are moving into the cities. And we talked about how the plague has opened up a lot of opportunities for farmers to move into these uh, once completely full cities. So more peasants were able to move out from underneath the thumbs of the noblemen, and they were now basically legally free. And so what comes out of this is that you have a Renaissance town or Renaissance city that is more complex. There are a lot more relationships going on. Um, there's a lot more freedom and a lot less fealty to the church and to the strictness of the Catholic Church. So with the Renaissance throughout Western Europe comes a lot more freedom, a lot more money flowing through the merchant class, and a lot less money going into the nobility. And this creates a disconnect between the church and society. And then there's also, from the Renaissance comes the impact of printing. Printing basically impacts all of intellectual life and thought. You can print things out a lot faster. You don't have to sit there and write everything out by hand, which makes it a lot easier to get your ideas out, to move it to the masses. And one of the first things that's actually printed and is actually pushed out is the Bible. The Bible traditionally was written by hand by monks in monasteries, and was in Latin, and it was very, very difficult for the layman to be able to read, and so they had to rely on the priests to interpret the Bible for them. Well, with the Gutenberg press, the Bibles become a lot more readily available, and they begin to be translated into the vernacular languages, so into Spanish, English, French, and German. So you're starting to see Bibles being able to be given out to the people, and the people can actually read for themselves the Bible, and the power of the priest begins to weaken because of that. And so not only does the Bible change the way that people's lives operate, printed books actually encourage scholarly research. You can actually find information that you couldn't before. People are doing research. All the research that I talked about earlier in about the Dark Ages not being this time of no advancements. You're starting to go back and find those advancements. You're starting to be able to figure out what scholars were discovering for the last 100 years or so that have been lost. And so you have a lot more scholarly research, and this goes hand in hand with the increase of literacy throughout Europe. So you're seeing a lay public that is actually literate and begins to read. So all these merchants, all of these people that are moving up in society, one of the things that helps them stand out from the peasants, from the rabble, is the ability to read. And so by having a steady available source of reading in books and later on in newspapers, etc., you see a learned class, a literate class begin to rise up. So the Renaissance, with its societal changes and its technological changes, really begins to play into um, uh, the effects that are ripe for even more change in Europe. And so we're moving forward. People are beginning to read. Society is going through an upheaval. And at the same time, there is the propagation of Christian humanism. And we talked about how the church begins to insert Christian thought into the ideas of the Renaissance, this humanistic approach to the Renaissance. And so, what Christian humanism does is it not only says that. Um, Humanity is good, humanity has worth. Basically, Christian humanism posits that human beings have the ability to reason and improve themselves. We are not stuck in our positions. You know, the way that God made us does not mean that is all that we are. Human beings have the ability to improve themselves on themselves, and more radical ideas begin to prop up that maybe the church isn't necessary. Maybe priests aren't necessary. Maybe even the Pope isn't necessary. In hushed tones, these things are said that if humanity has the ability to reason and the ability to improve, then maybe you don't need institutions governing their everyday lives. And so this leads to a lot of religious discontent among the people and among especially the nobility. And so you start seeing a lot of discontent with among the people with the church, especially since the church is has been corrupt. The Catholic Church has been corrupt for so long. The papacy is basically a position of that is kept to a small group of people. Usually, it is a dynastic. Um, a, a dynastic line. So you have sons of popes or relatives of popes moving in and becoming popes themselves. You have people that are speaking out against this corruption of the church are beginning to be persecuted. You start seeing things like the Inquisition rise up in the Middle Ages and continue throughout, and basically end around the middle of the 14th century. So you see all of this corruption, all of this um, basically this cronyism in the church that is not overlooked by a lot of high-ranking nobility. And then you also start seeing the idea of salvation through veneration of relics. Basically, what this says is that if you can bring a relic from the Holy Land, or if you can bring something from an old church in the Middle East, then God will look down upon you favorably, and you will earn points basically into to be able to get into heaven. And so this is especially true during the Crusades, and then in times after the Crusades. So you would have knights march into the Holy Land and ransack ancient temples and bring back relics from those old temples. And one of the things about the very, very early church is that the only way to really consecrate an altar would be to, within the altar, have an ancient relic or even a bone of a saint or martyr within. And so the knights would know this, and they would break altars and take those relics from within and ransack different churches. So you would see them bringing back these relics, and then these relics would basically change hands throughout throughout the decades after, and you would have them found and coming into the church. So basically, all of these priceless relics have been stolen from the Holy Land from other churches, from especially Orthodox churches, and are being brought back into Western Europe. And so there's a lot of people are especially clergy are upset that the Pope and the hierarchy of the church have condoned this act, as they are destroying other churches. But this is a way to get to salvation, and another different way to get to salvation is through indulgences. And basically, indulgences are the practice of reducing one's time in purgatory by donating to the church. Basically, you have the church says, well, if pay us this much money and we will pray extra hard for you. And according to Catholic dogma, it is through prayer, through praying for people's souls, that you take time off of purgatory before you are allowed time in, allowed to go into the gates, through the gates of heaven. So basically, there's a waiting line, and you have to have people pray for you, have to spend the time in purgatory. And so, what the church is saying is that pay us money, we will use that money to get people to pray for you. And so they will basically, the richer you are, the more sin you can commit, and it'd be okay. Basically, as someone pointed out, it's kind of like a get out of hell free card, that that you can do whatever you want Monday through Saturday, and on Sunday you go in to church and pay however much money that you want, and that basically makes the church a lot more lopsided towards the people with money, and the people down at the bottom begin to see that, well, there is uh, that things aren't equal among the church. There's two different sets of rules among the church, one for the rich and powerful and one for the rest. So you see a lot of um, discontent among the people, and this is going to and among the clergy themselves, as they begin to look at the church with this idea that things need to change, that there needs to be a change through the acts of the church. Now, before the Reformation, there have been attempts to change church law, to make it much more egalitarian, to make it much more peaceful. There have been different people that have been executed as heretics because they were trying to change the way that the church operated. They're trying to make it much more directed towards the laity, or they disagreed with the fundamental teachings of the church. And so every time that this would happen, the ideas were quickly snuffed out, and the people were quickly excommunicated, and the reforms failed. This all changes with Martin Luther. Martin Luther, shown here, was a German priest and a theology professor. You have to watch out for those professors. They have all sorts of weird ideas. But Martin Luther, as a theology professor and as a priest, had an intimate knowledge of Scripture and of the teachings of the church, and he found a lot of these things were sort of faulty in his estimation. He really felt that the church was moving away from the teachings of Christ, and was moving away from the fundamentals of the original church. So Luther's main criticisms of the church is that it's only what is in the Bible that matters. The church teachings and the sacraments of the church, these things that came after the Bible was written, these things that have grown throughout the centuries afterwards, those don't matter. What matters is what's inside the Bible. All those different things are sort of clouding what is ultimately the message in the Bible. And he really felt that there was only salvation through faith. It was faith that would save people's souls. It was not penance. It was not works. It was only salvation through faith. It was basically, the more faithful you were to God, that was the way that your eternal soul will be saved. It wasn't giving money to the church. It wasn't working for the church. It wasn't even doing good deeds. Basically, it was only your faith that mattered in salvation. And one of the things that is mostly beefed up about Luther's criticism of the church is his criticism of indulgences. This was actually one of his lesser complaints. He was more concerned with salvation by faith and the getting rid of sacraments. His criticism of indulgences is basically that it is not in the Bible. Other people are going to come by afterwards later on and say that these indulgences create an unfair condition for the poor. That basically the poor are left out of heaven because they can't afford it. Martin Luther wasn't really concerned with this part of the criticism of the church. He wasn't an egalitarian. He wasn't a man of the people. Martin Luther was a theology professor. He was a priest. He was concerned more with what he saw in the church as faulty theology. All of these different ideas of egalitarianism, of breaking the shackles of the church, all of these different are things that are ideas that come after Martin Luther, that Martin Luther himself would not agree with. Martin Luther was not trying to create a new religion, he was not trying to split the church. Martin Luther was trying to reform. Martin Luther wanted to change the church. He was trying to reform thus the name, the Reformation. That's what he wanted. Instead, what happens is that he begins to snowball effects that end up changing Christian religion in the West up to the present day. So what Martin Luther does is he is extremely upset with the way that the church is operating. He doesn't agree with church theology. He doesn't agree with their interpretation of the Bible. And so what he does is he writes out 95 theses. And these theses are basically dialectics. So it is saying, if God is this, then this must be true. If this is true, then this must be true. It's basically a debate, 95 different points of debate that he has with the church, 95 different ideas that he says, we need to discuss these different issues. Most of them have to do with salvation by faith, the idea of too many sacraments, too many idols in churches, and the idea of opulence versus humility. And then also comes the idea of indulgences. So these 95 theses he writes out, and then on October 31st, on All Hallows Eve of 1517, Martin Luther nails these theses to the church door. He goes out to his church in Wittenberg, Germany, in Castle Church, and goes and nails these theses to the church, and that church is still there, and the door is still there, so you can see the door where he nailed the theses in Wittenberg. In 2017, the church actually celebrated the 500 years of his um, pro, protesting of the church and the nailing of the theses with a ceremony there headed by the head of the Lutheran Church in Germany. So it's a very it's one of those great things that it's still preserved, that it survived things like World War II, like the bombings in World War II, and it's still intact to this day. But Castle Church in Wittenberg, Germany, um, uh, is where Martin Luther went and nailed his theses to the church. So what happens afterwards is that Martin Luther begins to preach this new idea of simplicity, of salvation by faith, and it begins um, take to really take a hold in Germany. With all of these societal issues, with everything, um, you begin to see that that his ideas are actually taking hold this time. It's not something that's going to be um, quickly subsumed by the church. That they're not going to be able to snuff him out and tamp this down. This is something that's growing legs and taking steam. And so, in a few years after after the beginning of his attempt to reform the church and looking um, to change the church from within. The church asks for Martin Luther to come in and debate with the cardinal or the bishop in Worms, and so Martin Luther does. Martin Luther goes in and he gives an impassioned debate with the bishop, and the bishop says, "Okay, next, next time we let's take a break here. Let's hold off on this, and then we will go ahead and come back tomorrow morning. Go to your room, and we will continue this." Sometime as Martin Luther is going back and is going to rest, he gets tipped off that they are going to arrest him, that they are going to take him, and so in the middle of the night, Martin Luther escapes and runs off, and sure enough, the church was going to have him arrested the next day. It was clear that he was not going to renounce his teachings, and so instead, Martin Luther begins his life on the run. He is excommunicated in January of 1521 and becomes an enemy of the Catholic Church. And it is from here that this idea of reform moves into protest. You go from this Reformation movement into this new idea of a Protestant church. If you look at the word Protestant, you can't spell Protestant without protest. And that is exactly what the people are doing. They're protesting the ideas of the church, and they are beginning to create a new church. And so Luther's movement then from here begins to grow and spread, mainly because he is on the run and is writing all over Germany. He basically lives the rest of his life from castle to castle, being kept by people that he persuades or that they choose to begin to follow him, break away from the Catholic Church. And so his movement begins to grow and spread. And then at this time, 1517, 1521, you're looking at the height of the Renaissance in Western Europe, the height of the Gutenberg press. And so all of his ideas are being put into pamphlets, into books, and they're being circulated throughout Germany, or throughout what will become Germany. There's no Germany just yet, but it's circulated throughout the German states, and it begins to grow and he spread. His ideas begin to grow, and this is one of the reasons why his religious reform succeeds, whereas others had failed, is because it is easy for other people to read it. His ideas are in German. They're written in German. Germany has a high literacy rate, and so you have a lot more people reading his works, and they agree with him about the corruption of the church. They agree about the idea that you shouldn't have to put all of this work in. You shouldn't have to put all this money into the church to save your own soul. You could do it yourself. And so his ideas go throughout the German states. And pretty soon they move from church to church. And these churches begin to break away from the Catholic Church. They begin to declare themselves in protest. They begin to declare themselves as Protestant churches. And they begin to declare themselves as Lutheran churches. Luther himself would not have wanted at the beginning to have a new movement named after himself, but he gets that to this day. And the Lutherans exist up to this day in slightly different forms than they did in the original form in Luther's time. But the church is one of the biggest churches in the world. And so one of the things that happens is as this idea is moving uh, from church to church, city to city, is that you have this breakaway the from the church, and these and German rulers actually begin to adopt Lutheranism as the official religion of their different baronies or dukedoms or even kingdoms. And you can see here on this map that it is the northern uh, German uh, states that really take to Lutheranism, while the southern portions of the Germanic states, they remain Catholic for the most part. And in the middle there, you also even see a new religion that's going to prop up this idea, this new religion that's also going to be in protest, and this new religion known as Calvinism. So, as I said, the northern half adopts Lutheranism, while the southern half remains Catholic. Now, I alluded to other splinter groups that form, and that's really what happens here. The Reformation spreads, and people begin to take the ideas of Martin Luther and begin to expand on them or adapt them to their own beliefs. One of those persons is John Calvin, the founder of Calvinism. And Calvinism is this extension uh, of Lutheranism, in the idea that the church can't really interpret God's will and know what God is thinking. Um, John Calvin basically says that everything uh, that God has set out is unknowable by man. So no one on earth can really understand what God's plans are, or what God's ideas for humanity are. And one of the things that separates Calvin from Martin Luther is the idea of salvation by faith. Calvin has a bone to pick with this idea of salvation of faith, because John Calvin believes in predestination, believes that God's will is so unknowable that God has even predestined us to heaven or hell before we were even born. We can't even know what we are what is going to happen to our souls after we die. That is not up for us to understand. It is already predestined. God has chosen it, and whatever faith we have is not going to save us. It is only in God's hands. Now, normally this would basically lead to this idea of hedonism, and saying, well, it doesn't matter, we can do whatever we want. However, Calvinists begin to look at the world differently, and they begin to work without regard to any sort of reward. Basically, the other part of Calvin's teachings is that the earth is part of God's grace. Humanity and civilization are part of God's plan on this earth. And so what we need to do in order to be godly people is to improve God's grace, is to continue to improve God's will on this earth. So we need to continue to make um, uh, our societies better and make the world a better place, without any sort of regard to our any sort of rewards that we will have on this earth. And that plays into later ideas that are going to come from him, because one of the things that John Calvin believes in is this democratic ideal that everybody in Calvinist villages and towns have a vote, have a say in what happens. And there's a lot of ideas of hard work and a strong work ethic, which will continue to move towards as you start looking at colonization of the world. And we will get back into that later on this semester. So that is John Calvin. That is one of the many, many different splinter groups that begin to emerge, and is one of the most important, especially in world history as we go forward. Now, another splinter group that forms splinters off not because of religion, but because of politics. The English Reformation. This English Reformation was rooted in politics, not religion. It was not a religious a battle, though it did have religious connotations. It was basically this political idea of the King of England wanting something, and the church not giving it to him. Basically, what happens is King Henry VIII desired a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. In the 1530s, 1532, I believe, Catherine of Aragon is engaged and then marries Henry VIII's older brother, who dies mysteriously a month into their marriage. Catherine of Aragon is the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, and Catherine of Aragon is a very important political piece for the Pope. The Spanish crown is heavily, heavily Christian, and you're talking about 1530, whereas which is 13 years after the 95 Theses, and less than a decade, 9 years after Martin Luther really begins to spread his message out. And so Protestantism is greatly increasing its hold in Europe, and the Pope wants to put an end to this by bringing in one of the stronger kingdoms, the British Crown, in and merging it with the Spanish Crown, which also controls part of the Holy Roman Empire, which would create a very, very strong Catholic um, hold on Europe. And so Henry VIII then is now the new heir to the throne. And so Catherine of Aragon swears in court that her marriage was not consummated. And so you have Henry VIII marrying Catherine, and they begin to attempt to have children. And Catherine cannot produce any male heirs. She has a daughter, Mary, and then children that die in childbirth or infancy. And King Henry VIII is angry. He wants a male heir, and pretty soon he has his eyes set on another woman to have that heir with, Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn is going to basically move into the is going to move into the role of queen, as long as Henry VIII gets his wish um, to divorce Catherine of Aragon. He wishes to divorce, and the Pope says no. The cardinals say no. He must complete. He must stay married. Their child will be the ruler of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, and the English crown as well. And so Henry VIII says, "No, I'm going to do it anyway." And Henry VIII uh, has Catherine of Aragon executed and marries Anne Boleyn. Uh, Ironically enough, Anne Boleyn is not going to have a male heir either. She will end up being one of Henry's many, many wives. But her daughter will be much more important later on. And so basically, Henry VIII splits away from the church and signs the Act of Supremacy in 1534. Gives the king control of doctrine, clerical appointments, and discipline. So basically, the King of England is the head of the English Church and is the head of the uh, Kingdom of England. So he is in charge of people's bodies and souls. He is supreme over the hearts, minds, and souls of the people. And after this, you start seeing um, the wheels basically spin off, and you start seeing the Pope and Catholics and Protestants and under their leaders begin to fight, begin to engage in conflict, and this leads to war. In the 1600s, you start seeing a lot more outright battles between Protestants and Catholics. The 30 Years' War, which starts almost 101 years after the 95 Theses, you have the beginning of this 30 Years' War, which, way to go, historians, you actually got this to 30 years. The 30 Years' War is a war between Roman Catholic uh, and Protestant forces. It is a war between England, France, and the German states. So wars begin to take an even more dangerous connotation as religion gets into it. Instead of fighting against one another for control of the physical plane, you're also fighting for control of a spiritual plane. So wars between European wars take on religious connotations. So they're fighting in amongst each other, while at the same time this is an overarching battle between Protestants and Catholics that begins to shape what is going to happen later on. Eventually, in 1648, you have a stalemate between Catholics and Protestants, and there needs to be a peace. And you have that the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 legitimizes Protestantism. France emerges as the dominant nation in the continent, while England still holds a lot of power among the people, and begins to hold an even bigger power over in the colonies, which we'll get back to in a few weeks. So France and England are dominant nations. The other nations are pretty much secondary to France and England. So basically, the question then is begged: why does the Reformation spread? The Reformation spreads for these four reasons. And one, this opposition to Catholicism, this idea that the church is faulty, that the church is overbearing, that the church is wrong, uh, leads a lot of people to moving away from the church. You also have nationalistic ambitions. You have kingdoms that wish to expand their power, that wish to expand and gain a lot more physical, a lot more wealth, and a lot more land, and they can't do that as long as the Pope controls what they're doing. And so, with these ambitions, we're still talking about these new monarchs and the new ideas of monarchy. These ambitions of pushing forward, mixed in with this old land wishes for land, creates the beginnings of nationalism. The the embryonic ideas of nationalism begin to take hold here. You also have the Renaissance ideals of freedom, of humanity, of being escaping from the church, of not needing the church to improve yourself. And then, of course, technology, the printing press. Reformation spreads quickly because you can quickly write these missiles about how the church is wrong. You can write your ideas down very, very quickly, and you can spread it to the people in their own language. And so, these four reasons, the opposition to Catholicism, nationalistic ambitions, Renaissance ideals, and the printing press, are why Reformation spreads so quickly. Now, the impact of the Reformation is going to be felt far and wide. You're going to see a social impact because of the Reformation. Family then is placed at the center of life in Protestant denominations. The church was the center of life under Catholicism, but now you have the family placed at the center of life. And you have the husband placed at the center the of the home. They're the head of household. Women then become secondary. Women are there to teach. Women are there to raise children. Women are sort of pushed into the margins, and for women, family life is their only destiny. Their only way to make things make things better uh, is to raise a good family. And so, for women, you see them taking a step backward. Family life becomes their only destiny. Now, on top of this, you have a Catholic Reformation that needs to take place. The Catholics have to say, are we going to reform ourselves, or are we going to buckle down and counter to this Reformation? And the answer is a resounding yes. They both reform, and they buckle down on their own ideas. This revitalizes the church. The church begins to look at what is working and what is not working about the church, and begins to change to make themselves a lot more relevant to the people, and to reaffirm for the most hardcore of Catholics. Ultimately, the impact of the Reformation when it comes to theology is that there's this idea that both Catholicism and Protestantism contain elements of truth. You know, Catholicism and Protestantism must coexist in the end. You know, there is this idea that Catholicism will never be able to wipe out Protestantism, and Protestantism will never be able to wipe out Catholicism. So they must be able to coexist in some way. And even if this coexisting involves oftentimes military intervention, you do see this sort of coexisting occurring among the laity. And so, to really look at this counter Reformation of the Catholic Church, how the Catholic Church moves forward. Well, what happens is the Pope calls for the Council of Trent, and in this Council of Trent, the people begin. You have basically the best theological minds of the Catholic Church coming in and figuring out how to move forward. And one of the things that they do is they reaffirm traditional Catholic teachings. As I said, they do buckle down, and they double down on some of their ideals, and then they reaffirm those ideals, and they push those ideals forward, such as the sacraments, such as the infallibility of the Pope and things, or excuse me, not the infallibility, the direct line between God and the Pope. And in this idea of the direct line between the papacy and God, they figure out that you need to reform the papacy. The church's problems are seen as the corrupt policies of popes and cardinals. So basically, what the Council of Trent says is that the Pope has. The Pope talks directly to God, but the Pope hasn't been listening to God. They have corrupt policies of popes and cardinals. There are several ex-popes that are actually excommunicated throughout this. And so basically, they're saying now that we have changed this, the Pope is now infallible. The Pope now listens to God, and all our corrupt policies have been erased, and never more will the church ever find itself undermining God's will, and never will the church again find itself in any sort of legal issues ever again. Never, 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 ever again. So, outside of reforming the papacy and reaffirming some of their teachings, the Counter Reformation brings in the Inquisition. Brings back the Inquisition. The Inquisition had been lying dormant for about 100 years, and so the Inquisition is reinstated throughout the regions. And we will talk more about the Inquisition later on. You also have the creation of the Society of Jesus to sort of counter the rising influence of Protestant theologians and Protestant education. The Society of Jesus, also known as Jesuits, are a new order that's founded by, I believe his name is Ignatius Loyola, a soldier, a former soldier and priest that wants to basically push Catholicism heavily among the people. And so basically, this new society of Jesus has absolute obedience to the papacy, and they are dedicated to engage in conflict for God. So Jesuits are sort of known as the as God's soldiers or God's Marines, and they are basically the direct line from the Pope into the people. They are there to propagate the Catholic faith. They are there to spread the Catholic faith, so they're going to be the missionaries that are on the front lines, moving forward, especially in the age of exploration, which we'll get to in a few weeks. So they are the ones that are out there, and they're also the ones that are leading the charge for education, for medicine, for learning. The Society of Jesus Jesuits are going to be setting up universities, are going to be setting up schools, hospitals throughout Europe and into the entirety of the world as Catholic ideas move out. So you're going to see the Society of Jesus take a big role in missionary work, in in conversion policies, but also in health and education. Most of the older Catholic universities here in the Americas were actually founded by Jesuits. And you see that, especially on the East Coast and in Latin America, there's a lot of Jesuit universities. So, with the creation of the Society of Jesus and with the Council of Trent, you start seeing the new Catholic Church and their new priorities of reaffirming their own teachings and also spreading these teachings out. And so that's where we'll end our course, our course lecture today. We will meet for our class period, and we will go over some of these ideas and some of the readings in the book, and we will go ahead and do a much deeper dive. This was a very broad outline of the Renaissance and Reformation, but our class period will be more to discuss some of these topics and get really into it. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I hope you continue to enjoy the lectures throughout this semester.